The worst thing Ethan Walker ever saw on Kepri 9 wasn't the suffering. It was how normal everyone acted around it. Acid rain hissed against the steel rooftops of the lower market district while neon advertisements flickered through the mist in 6 shades of blue and orange. The air smelled like burnt wiring, recycled sweat, and overheated engines struggling to survive another 12-hour cycle. Somewhere above the crowded transit lanes, cargo freighters groaned through the clouds like dying giants. Nobody looked up anymore. Nobody looked at anything for very long on Kepri 9. That was how people survived. Ethan pulled the collar of his faded work jacket higher against the cold drizzle as he moved through the crowd outside Transit Plaza 12. His boots splashed through shallow puddles glowing faint green from chemical runoff, while station announcements echoed overhead in 6 different languages. Public entertainment licenses remain active until 0200 hours. Please report unauthorized compassion violations to local security personnel. Ethan barely heard it. After 8 years on the station, the announcements blurred into background noise like ventilation fans or reactor hums. He was exhausted. His shoulders ached from another double shift repairing oxygen recyclers in Sector C, and the smell of machine coolant still clung to his hands no matter how many times he washed them. All he wanted was a hot meal, 6 hours of sleep, and maybe enough credits left by the end of the week to fix the heating unit in his apartment. Then he heard the sound. Not screaming. That would have been easier. It was quieter than that. A sharp inhale, like someone trying very hard not to make noise. Ethan slowed near the center of the plaza. A crowd had gathered beneath a massive holographic billboard advertising luxury off-world vacations most people on Kepri 9 would never afford. Some watched with amusement, others with boredom. A few scanned their wrist devices while eating street food from steaming paper trays. In the middle of the square, beneath the glow of rotating advertisements, a young alien woman knelt against a metal restraint pillar with a glowing neural collar wrapped around her throat. Her pale turquoise skin shimmered under the rain, almost silver where water rolled down her arms. Long white hair clung wetly to her face and shoulders. She couldn't have been older than 23. 24 maybe. A digital sign above her displayed a simple message in bright corporate lettering. Public sentence active. Interaction tokens, 5 credits. Ethan stared as a businessman stepped forward casually, scanned his payment chip against the terminal beside the pillar, and walked away without even looking back. The collar emitted a soft pulse of blue light. The alien girl jerked slightly. Not violently. Just enough for Ethan to notice the way her fingers curled tightly against the wet pavement afterward. The crowd laughed quietly. Somebody muttered, "Guess she deserved it." Another voice answered, "At least this one's prettier than last week's." Ethan felt something cold settle deep in his stomach. The girl kept her eyes lowered. That somehow made it worse. She wasn't begging, wasn't screaming, wasn't even trying to fight anymore. She just looked tired, like someone who already knew nobody was coming. Rainwater dripped from Ethan's hair onto his jacket sleeve as he stood frozen near the edge of the plaza. He should leave. This wasn't his business. Kepri 9 had laws about interference, and those laws existed to protect people with money and punish people without it. Everyone knew that. He shifted his weight to walk away. Then the collar flashed again after another paid scan. This time the girl inhaled sharply through clenched teeth before quickly lowering her head farther, as if embarrassed someone had heard her. Ethan stopped moving. Around him, hundreds of people continued walking beneath the neon rain without slowing down. A little alien boy tugged his mother's hand and pointed toward the girl. The mother gently turned his head away and kept walking. Above them, the billboard changed advertisements again. Bright beaches, blue oceans, smiling faces. Ethan looked back at the girl one last time. Her trembling hands rested against the wet pavement beneath her while cold rain rolled down the glowing collar at her throat. And for the first time in a very long while, Ethan Walker realized he was angry enough to be afraid of himself. Ethan made it halfway across the transit bridge before he stopped walking again. Below him, endless streams of traffic drifted through the artificial night of Kepri, 9 in layers of white engine trails and blinking navigation lights. The station stretched for miles in every direction, a steel labyrinth wrapped around an aging mining core that had not been properly maintained in decades. Somewhere deep beneath the lower districts, reactor pumps groaned through the walls like a dying heartbeat. Ethan rested both hands against the cold railing and closed his eyes for a second. He could still hear the sound she made. Not pain, restraint. like she had already learned nobody cared unless she became entertaining. Forget it, he muttered to himself. Not your problem. The words felt hollow the second they left his mouth. He pushed away from the railing and kept moving through the crowded corridors toward residential Sector 8. Vendors shouted over each other beneath glowing signs written in human and alien dialects. Steam rose from food carts into the freezing recycled air, while old maintenance drones drifted overhead, spraying chemical disinfectant that smelled faintly like bleach and burnt copper. 2 station officers stood outside a gambling hall laughing at something on a handheld screen. Nobody looked worried. Nobody looked guilty. Ethan hated that most of all. By the time he reached his apartment block, the rain had followed him indoors as dampness clinging to his jacket sleeves and hair. The hallway lights flickered weakly above rows of rust-stained doors, while broken ventilation fans rattled overhead. Apartment 8C smelled exactly like he expected. Cold metal, dust, old coffee grounds. He tossed his work badge onto the counter and tried turning on the heater again. The machine buzzed twice before dying with a pathetic click. Of course, Ethan sighed. He rubbed both hands over his face and stared at the small kitchenette across the room. Half a loaf of bread. Protein packs. 1 beer left in the cooler. Rent overdue notice blinking red on the wall terminal. Same as always. He should have been numb to it by now. Instead, all he could think about was the girl kneeling in the rain under that glowing collar while strangers paid 5 credits to hurt someone they did not even know. Ethan sat heavily on the edge of his narrow bed and stared at the floor. He remembered the first time he arrived on Kepri, 8 years ago. Back then the station still had hope buried somewhere under the rust and greed. People talked about expansion projects, better districts, real futures. Then the corporations tightened control. Entertainment laws changed. Public punishments became profitable. And slowly everyone stopped asking questions because asking questions made survival harder. Ethan leaned back against the wall and exhaled slowly. You looked away too, he whispered to himself. That truth sat heavier than he wanted. He had seen the crowd, judged them silently. But he walked away first just like everybody else. A sudden burst of laughter echoed outside his apartment window from the neighboring walkway. Ethan stood and crossed the room automatically. Through the rain-streaked glass, he could barely make out a giant public screen hanging over the district plaza several blocks away. The same advertisement loop still flickered across it. Luxury worlds. Blue skies. Perfect lives. Then the feed glitched for half a second. The image changed. Ethan froze. It was the plaza camera. Just for an instant. Long enough to show the alien girl still kneeling beneath the restraint pillar while rainwater soaked through her white hair. The collar around her throat pulsed faint blue in the darkness. She had not moved. The advertisement returned immediately afterward like nothing happened. Ethan stared through the glass for several seconds before grabbing his jacket again. His hand paused briefly near the apartment door controls. This was dangerous. Stupid. Security patrols protected public sentence zones aggressively because too much money moved through them every night. Helping her could cost him his job, his apartment, maybe worse. Behind him, the broken heater clicked uselessly in the silence. Ethan opened the door anyway. Yeah, he muttered quietly as cold. Corridor air rushed into the room. I am definitely going to regret this. The plaza looked different after midnight. Quieter. Colder. The entertainment crowds had mostly disappeared, leaving behind overflowing trash bins, puddles glowing beneath neon reflections, and maintenance drones gliding silently through the rain with blinking amber lights. Somewhere in the upper levels of Kepri, 9, music still echoed faintly through ventilation shafts from clubs that never closed, but down here the station felt tired. Ethan kept his head lowered as he crossed the nearly empty square with a paper cup of hot broth warming his hands through the cold. The giant holographic billboard overhead flickered between advertisements every few seconds, washing the plaza in rotating colors of crimson, blue, and white. The alien girl was still there beneath the restraint pillar exactly where he had left her. Rain dripped steadily from the edge of the metal structure onto her shoulders, while the glowing collar around her throat emitted a faint mechanical hum. Up close, she looked even worse. Her pale turquoise skin had lost much of its color from the cold, and faint tremors ran through her hands where they rested against the pavement. Ethan slowed as he approached. For a second, he almost turned around again. The station cameras were mounted everywhere around the square. Every movement tracked. Every interaction logged. Then the girl slowly lifted her head. Violet eyes met his through wet strands of silver-white hair. Tired eyes. Empty eyes. She looked at the cup in his hands first, then at him. "If you paid for another scan," she said quietly, "at least wait until I can breathe again." Her voice surprised him. Soft. Controlled. Like someone who had spent a long time learning how not to sound afraid. Ethan stood there awkwardly for a second before crouching beside the pillar. "I did not pay for anything," he answered. "Then why are you here?" He held out the steaming cup carefully. "You looked cold." The girl stared at him without moving. Suspicion flickered across her face so quickly Ethan almost missed it. "That is not an answer. It is the only one I have." Rain hissed softly around them. Somewhere nearby, an old transit train groaned through magnetic rails overhead. Ethan noticed bruised marks beneath the collar now that he stood closer. Thin lines of irritated skin where the metal had rubbed against her throat for too long. The device itself looked older than standard security equipment. Cheap. Modified. The kind of thing built to keep hurting someone long after the original sentence ended. "What is your name?" he asked quietly. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Why?" "Because calling you the girl tied to a pole in the rain feels rude." For the first time since he had seen her, the faintest crack appeared in her expression. Not quite amusement. More like confusion at hearing something normal. "Human. Lyra," she finally said. "Lyra Vane." Ethan nodded once. "Ethan Walker." He placed the hot broth beside her carefully within reach. Lyra stared at it for several seconds before slowly wrapping trembling fingers around the cup. Steam rose between them into the freezing air. She held it like she had forgotten what warmth felt like. "You should leave, Ethan Walker," she murmured after a moment. "The cameras are recording this." "Yeah, I figured." "Then you are either brave or very stupid." Ethan glanced up at the blinking surveillance lens mounted above the billboard. Probably the second one. That almost earned him a smile. Almost. The collar around Lyra's throat suddenly emitted a faint pulse again. She flinched instinctively before catching herself a second later. Ethan's jaw tightened. He had repaired enough industrial equipment in his life to recognize failing systems. The pulse timing was irregular now. Wrong. Not entertainment settings anymore. Overload cycling. His eyes narrowed as he leaned closer to examine the collar. Water dripped from his hair onto the glowing metal ring, while tiny warning indicators blinked red beneath its surface. Ethan felt his stomach sink. "Lyra," he said slowly, "how long have they kept this thing on you?" She looked away toward the empty plaza. 3 days. Ethan stared at the failing circuitry beneath the rain. 3 days was impossible. Those collars were never meant for continuous use longer than a few hours. The system was overheating. Damaging tissue. Maybe worse. Lyra noticed the change in his expression immediately. "What?" she asked quietly. Ethan looked back at her pale, exhausted face beneath the neon rain and realized something cold. By morning, the station was not expecting her to survive. Ethan had spent nearly 9 years repairing broken systems on Kepri 9. Air scrubbers, cargo loaders, cooling pumps held together with cheap welds and corporate denial. Machines always told the truth eventually. You just had to know where to listen. And the collar around Lyra's throat was screaming. Rainwater rolled across the glowing metal band, while warning indicators flashed weak red beneath layers of damaged casing. Ethan leaned closer, ignoring the freezing water soaking through his jacket sleeves. He could smell overheating circuitry now beneath the acid rain and ozone. Burnt plastic. Electrical decay. The station maintenance side of his brain immediately started calculating timelines without permission. Heat output. Power cycling. Neural feedback exposure. None of the numbers were good. "Ethan." Lyra's voice sounded smaller this time. "What is wrong with it?" He looked up slowly. Her violet eyes watched him carefully through wet strands of silver-white hair. She already knew the answer. People only asked questions like that when they were hoping someone would lie kindly. Ethan exhaled through his nose and stood. "The regulator is failing," he admitted quietly. "These collars are supposed to rotate pulse intervals. Yours is stuck running continuous feedback loops." Lyra lowered her gaze again. No surprise. No panic. Just tired acceptance. Somehow that hit harder than fear would have. "I see." Ethan rubbed one hand across the back of his neck while rain hissed softly around them. "You should not still be conscious." That does not sound encouraging. It is not. Above them, another station announcement echoed through hidden speakers. Public sentence zone closing in 3 hours. Citizens are reminded that unauthorized assistance remains punishable under corporate ordinance. Ethan glanced automatically toward the nearest surveillance camera. Small black lens. rotating slowly, watching everything. He hated how normal that felt now. Lyra shifted slightly against the restraint pillar, wincing almost invisibly as the collar emitted another unstable pulse. Her fingers tightened around the empty broth cup he had given her earlier because it was the only warm thing she still had. "They know the collar is failing," she said softly after a moment. Ethan frowned. "What?" The guard stopped checking it yesterday. Rain dripped from the edge of the holographic billboard overhead in glowing blue streaks. "This was never meant to be a public sentence anymore," Lyra continued quietly. "It became an execution when the crowd lost interest." Ethan felt something ugly twist in his chest at the calmness in her voice, like she had already rehearsed dying alone long before tonight. He crouched again beside the pillar, closer this time. "Listen to me carefully," he said. "If I can access the rear maintenance port, I might be able to shut the regulator down temporarily." Lyra's eyes widened slightly. "You can do that?" "Maybe." Ethan studied the collar again. "But it will trigger station security the second the system detects interference." "Then you should not try." "Yeah, probably." Another weak pulse flickered through the metal ring. Lyra inhaled sharply before forcing herself still again. Ethan noticed something then. She always tried to hide the reaction afterward. Not from pride exactly. More like shame. As if suffering publicly long enough had taught her to apologize for her own pain. Ethan looked away for a second because suddenly he could not stand seeing it anymore. The plaza remained mostly empty now except for a few late-night workers crossing toward the transit rails. Nobody stopped. Nobody looked closely. One janitorial drone rolled past, spraying disinfectant across the pavement only inches from Lyra's knees before continuing on without hesitation. Ethan laughed quietly under his breath. Not because anything was funny, because if he did not laugh, he was probably going to break something. Lyra tilted her head slightly. "What?" Ethan stared out at the endless neon reflections across the rain-soaked plaza. "This station used to mine titanium for colony ships," he said. "Thousands of people built their lives here." He looked back at her pale, exhausted face beneath the glowing collar. "Now people pay 5 credits to watch somebody freeze in the rain." For a moment, neither of them spoke. Only the sound of distant engines and falling water filled the empty square. Then Lyra asked the question quietly. "Why does that bother you so much, Ethan Walker?" Ethan opened his mouth automatically before stopping himself. Because the truth sounded stupid. Dangerous, too. He barely knew her. She was a stranger chained to a pillar in a city built on strangers ignoring each other. But the answer came anyway. Because every person who walked past you tonight kept pretending they could not feel anything anymore. He looked directly into her violet eyes beneath the rain. "And I am starting to think that is what scares me most about this place." The rain finally began to slow sometime after 2 a.m., but the cold only got worse. Khepri, 9 always felt cruelest during the final hours before artificial dawn. The station lights dimmed automatically to conserve power, leaving the lower districts wrapped in long shadows and flickering neon reflections. Ethan sat beside the restraint pillar with his back against the wet metal wall of a closed pharmacy kiosk, while Lyra remained curled quietly beneath the glowing collar. Neither of them had spoken for several minutes. Somewhere overhead, pipes groaned through the ceiling structure as heating systems redirected energy toward the upper corporate sectors where people with real money slept in climate-controlled comfort. Down here, the cold stayed. Ethan flexed numb fingers and glanced again at the collar around Lyra's throat. The pulse intervals were getting shorter now. Every few minutes, the damaged regulator emitted another unstable flicker that made faint blue light ripple beneath her pale skin before fading again. She barely reacted anymore. That scared him more than the earlier flinches. Human bodies screamed when they reached their limits. Machines failed loudly too. But exhausted people sometimes just went quiet. Lyra suddenly shifted against the pillar, her breathing uneven for half a second before stabilizing again. Ethan leaned forward immediately. "Hey." She opened her eyes slowly. "I am still alive." "Yeah, I noticed." Her lips moved faintly like she almost smiled at that. "Almost." Ethan reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small thermal wrap from his maintenance kit. Cheap emergency issue. Thin silver material designed to hold body heat during hull repair emergencies. He unfolded it carefully and draped it over her shoulders. Lyra froze at the contact. Ethan paused instantly. "Sorry." "No," she whispered quietly. "I just forgot what it felt like." The words landed harder than he expected. Ethan sat back down beside her without speaking for a moment. Across the empty plaza, Giant advertisements continued cycling endlessly through luxury products and smiling faces, while maintenance drones cleaned puddles nobody cared about. The station looked polished from far away. Up close, everything smelled like rust and desperation. Lyra pulled the thermal wrap tighter around herself. "Humans confuse me," she murmured eventually. Ethan snorted softly. "You and me both." No, her violet eyes studied him carefully beneath the dim plaza lights. "Your species builds weapons faster than almost anyone in the systems. Your colonies consume worlds. Your corporations created places like this station." She glanced weakly toward the surrounding city. "And yet you stopped because a stranger was cold." Ethan looked down at his hands. Grease stains still marked his fingertips from work earlier that night. "Maybe humans are just inconsistent." "No," Lyra said quietly. "That is not the word." A train thundered somewhere above them through magnetic rails, making the plaza tremble faintly beneath their feet. Ethan watched steam drift upward from a nearby street vent into the freezing air before speaking again. "Why were you really sentenced?" Lyra went still. The question lingered between them while rainwater dripped steadily from the restraint pillar overhead. Ethan immediately regretted asking. "Forget it," he said. "You do not have to answer." But Lyra surprised him. "My father governed the Helion trade systems," she said, softly after several seconds. 8 colony worlds, shipping routes, resource contracts." Ethan frowned slightly. That kind of political power existed far above people like him. "You are serious." Unfortunately, her voice carried no pride, only exhaustion. "The public sentence was meant to erase me quietly without causing political instability." Ethan stared at her. "You are telling me somebody chained a governor's daughter to a pole in the middle of a shopping district?" "Former governor's daughter," Lyra corrected faintly. "And yes." Ethan laughed once under his breath in disbelief. "That is insane." "I disagreed publicly with the corporate suffering markets." She looked out toward the empty plaza where crowds had stood earlier. "I called them morally diseased during a transmission hearing." Ethan blinked. "That was you." Lyra tilted her head weakly. "You heard about it?" "Everybody heard about it. The networks buried the story after 2 days." Ethan studied her face again, seeing something different now beneath the exhaustion and rain. Not weakness. Conviction. Somebody had looked at an entire system built on cruelty and said no out loud. And this station had punished her for it by turning pain into entertainment. Lyra noticed the shift in his expression immediately. "You should leave before security returns for morning cycle," she said quietly. Ethan looked back at the damaged collar glowing faintly around her throat, then at the nearly empty plaza, then at the surveillance cameras rotating overhead. "Yeah," he murmured slowly. "I do not think I am going anywhere anymore." Artificial dawn began at 5 a.m. on Kepri 9, though nobody would have mistaken it for a real sunrise. Long industrial light panels mounted high above the station's ceiling slowly brightened from dark blue to pale white, casting cold illumination across the lower districts like a hospital hallway waking up. The effect only made the plaza look more exhausted. Trash drifted through shallow puddles beneath flickering signs while exhausted workers started emerging from transit tunnels carrying tool cases and half-finished cups of synthetic coffee. Morning shift. Another cycle beginning. Ethan sat hunched beside the restraint pillar with tired eyes fixed on the collar around Lyra's throat. He had not slept. Lyra had drifted in and out of consciousness beside him for the last hour, though every pulse from the damaged regulator seemed slower now. Not better. Slower in the way failing engines slowed before dying completely. Ethan hated that he recognized the pattern so well. He rubbed both hands together for warmth before pulling his maintenance tablet from inside his jacket. The cracked screen flickered weakly to life beneath the station lights. Lyra stirred slightly beside him. "What are you doing?" she asked quietly. "Trying to see if the system still uses old maintenance architecture." Ethan connected a thin cable from his tablet into a hidden access panel near the restraint pillar. Tiny sparks flickered briefly beneath the rain-damped casing. Most corporate security systems are layered over outdated infrastructure. Cheap companies never replace anything if they can avoid it. Lyra watched him carefully. "And if you are wrong?" Ethan glanced at the nearest surveillance camera overhead. Then station security shows up, very motivated. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The plaza around them slowly came back to life as morning crowds returned. Some people noticed Ethan kneeling beside the restraint system. Most pretended not to. A delivery worker passed carrying crates stacked nearly 6 feet high and deliberately kept his eyes forward. An elderly alien woman slowed briefly near the edge of the plaza before lowering her gaze and continuing on. Nobody wanted involvement. Compassion on Khepri 9 was treated like a contagious disease. Ethan's tablet suddenly emitted a soft beep. Access denied flashed red across the cracked screen. He swore quietly under his breath. Encrypted override lock. Lyra closed her eyes briefly against the pillar behind her. I told you it would not be simple. Ethan disconnected the cable and frowned at the glowing collar again. There is still a way. Illegal. Extremely. That finally earned a faint, exhausted smile from her. Ethan noticed immediately how different she looked now compared to last night. The fear had faded somewhere during the long, freezing hours between rainstorms and silence. Not because things improved, because she no longer expected survival. That realization sat heavily in his chest. He hated how familiar it felt. Khepri 9 did that to people eventually. It convinced them endurance was the same thing as living. A loud mechanical hiss suddenly echoed across the plaza as armored station security officers emerged from a nearby transit elevator. Ethan stiffened instantly. 3 officers. Corporate insignias glowing silver across dark uniforms. One carried a portable scanner unit. Morning inspection. The lead officer announced lazily while approaching the sentence pillar. Looks like our entertainment piece survived the night. Ethan slowly stood. The officers finally noticed him properly. One raised an eyebrow beneath his visor. You her sponsor or something? Ethan kept his voice calm. Just checking the restraint regulator. It is malfunctioning. The officer glanced toward Lyra without interest. Not our problem. It becomes your problem when the system overheats publicly. Ethan gestured toward the damaged collar. This thing is close to neural cascade failure. The second officer laughed quietly. Listen to the mechanic. Lyra lowered her eyes immediately as the officers approached closer. Ethan noticed it right away. The subtle tension in her shoulders. The instinctive withdrawal. Not fear exactly. Familiarity. Like she already knew how these conversations ended. The lead officer crouched beside the restraint pillar and scanned the collar lazily with his handheld unit. A few seconds later, the device beeped green. System says active sentence remains authorized. He stood again with a shrug. If she burns out, sanitation can deal with it. Ethan felt anger rise so fast it almost surprised him. She is a person. The words slipped out before he could stop them. Silence settled briefly over the plaza. Even nearby pedestrians slowed slightly at hearing someone say it out loud. The lead officer studied Ethan for a long second beneath the pale station lights. Then he smiled without warmth. Not on this station, she is not. The officers turned and walked away, laughing quietly among themselves while their boots echoed across the wet pavement. Ethan stood frozen beside the pillar long after they disappeared into the transit corridor. Behind him, Lyra spoke softly without lifting her head. Now you understand. Ethan stared out at the waking city around them. Thousands of people moving through another ordinary morning while a dying girl remained chained beneath a glowing collar in the middle of the plaza. Then he looked back down at the cracked maintenance tablet still clutched in his hand. Something inside him settled into place quietly. Not hope. Not courage either. Just decision. No. Ethan said softly while reconnecting the cable to the restraint system again. I think now I am done asking permission. The maintenance tunnels beneath Khepri 9 smelled like hot metal, damp insulation, and years of neglect. Ethan moved quickly through the narrow service corridor with his tablet tucked beneath one arm, while overhead pipes rattled from the station's ancient heating systems. Red emergency lights pulsed faintly along the walls every few seconds, bathing the tunnel in rotating shadows. Somewhere above him, thousands of people continued their normal morning routines, completely unaware that a single exhausted maintenance worker had just decided to challenge an entire corporate security network with stolen tools and a cracked tablet battery sitting at 12% power. Ethan honestly was not sure which part of that sounded more insane. He slid to a stop beside a sealed maintenance hatch marked District Power Regulation Node 12B. Frost clung to the edges of the metal door where coolant lines passed through the wall. Ethan wiped sweat and rainwater from his forehead before kneeling beside the access panel. Come on, he muttered quietly while pulling wires from his toolkit. Please still use outdated architecture. The station hummed around him like some gigantic dying animal. Every vibration beneath the floor reminded him how old Khepri 9 really was. Layers built on top of layers. Cheap repairs covering older cheap repairs. Corporate management loved efficiency reports, but hated paying for actual infrastructure. Usually that made life miserable for maintenance crews. Today it might save someone's life. Ethan connected his tablet to the hatch interface. The screen flickered violently before lines of corrupted code scrolled across the display. Unauthorized access warnings immediately flashed red. He ignored them. Fingers moving quickly over the cracked screen, he rerouted local diagnostics through an abandoned coolant management protocol he had discovered years earlier during a reactor outage. The station security system hesitated for half a second. Then the hatch unlocked with a heavy metallic clunk. Ethan exhaled sharply. Thank you, lazy corporate budgeting. Inside the regulation node, old server towers filled the cramped chamber floor to ceiling while cooling fans whined loudly in the darkness. Blue status lights blinked endlessly across dusty hardware racks. Heat rolled through the room in waves despite the freezing corridors outside. Ethan squeezed between cables and aging processors until he found the restraint system relay hub mounted near the back wall. There it was. Public Sentence District Control. Ethan plugged his tablet directly into the relay core. This time the system responded immediately. His stomach tightened as Lyra's restraint profile appeared across the screen. Subject: Lyra VYN. Status: active. Duration: 78 hours. Life support limiters: disabled. Ethan stared at those last two words for several seconds. Disabled. Not malfunctioning. Intentional. They knew exactly what the collar was doing to her. His jaw clenched hard enough to ache. Another line of text appeared beneath the profile. Termination authorized at 0600 hours. Ethan checked the corner clock on his tablet. 5:42 a.m. 18 minutes. You sick bastards, he whispered. He immediately started bypassing the restraint controls manually. The system fought him at every step with authorization requests and encrypted lockouts, but Ethan knew industrial code better than the executives who designed the interface. He did not need elegant solutions. He just needed enough chaos to force the collar open for 5 seconds. 5 seconds would be enough. Warning alarms suddenly flickered amber across the relay screen. Security trace detected. Ethan's pulse spiked. Of course it did. He worked faster. Sweat rolled down the side of his face despite the cold station air, while fans screamed overhead. Somewhere deeper in the corridor outside, heavy boots echoed faintly through metal passageways. Security teams. Already moving. Ethan ignored it. Lines of code blurred together across the cracked screen while his hands flew over manual override sequences. One failed. Another almost worked. Then finally the restraint profile flashed yellow. Manual emergency release available. Ethan stared at the blinking confirmation icon. One press. That was all. The station would instantly know who triggered it. His employee records, housing credentials, transit permissions, everything tied to his identity would disappear within minutes afterward. Khepri, 9 did not forgive interference. Ethan looked down at the confirmation prompt while distant boots thundered closer through the tunnels. For a strange moment, he thought about his apartment heater still broken back in Sector 8. The unpaid rent notice blinking red on the wall terminal. The quiet, lonely routine waiting for him every day if he walked away right now. Then he remembered Lyra sitting alone beneath freezing rain, trying not to scream, because strangers found pain easier to tolerate when it stayed quiet. Ethan pressed the release command without hesitation. Somewhere far above the maintenance tunnels, alarms began to howl across District 12. The first thing Lyra heard was silence. Not true silence. Khepri, 9 never stopped making noise. Ventilation fans still rattled overhead. Transit rails still screamed through distant tunnels. Somewhere nearby, station alarms suddenly erupted into sharp mechanical pulses that echoed across the plaza like warning sirens during a hull breach. But the sound that had haunted her for 3 straight days was gone. The collar around her throat had stopped humming. Lyra blinked slowly beneath the pale, artificial dawn light. For a moment, she genuinely did not understand what had happened. Then the metal restraint around her neck clicked once. A tiny sound, barely louder than rainwater dripping. Onto pavement, the collar split apart and fell into her lap with a dull metallic weight. Across the plaza, pedestrians froze in confusion as warning lights began flashing red through District 12. Unauthorized sentence interruption detected. Security response initiated. Lyra stared at the broken restraint in her trembling hands while cold morning air touched the bruised skin of her throat for the first time in 78 hours. Freedom felt strangely weightless. Terrifying too. because part of her had already accepted she would die beneath that pillar before sunrise. Her breathing became uneven, not from pain anymore, from shock. A maintenance drone rolled past the plaza entrance before abruptly changing direction as emergency shutters started descending across nearby storefronts. Crowds scattered quickly through the district while station alarms continued pulsing overhead. Nobody wanted involvement once consequences became real. Lyra slowly tried to stand. Her legs nearly failed immediately beneath her. 3 days exposed to freezing rain and neural overload had left her body weak and shaking. She caught herself against the restraint pillar with one hand just before collapsing. "Easy." Ethan's voice reached her through the chaos. Lyra turned sharply. He emerged from a side maintenance corridor, moving fast through the flashing emergency lights, breathing hard, jacket soaked with sweat and dust from the tunnels below the station. His cracked tablet still hung from one hand, while security alarms reflected red across his tired face. For a second, neither of them spoke. Ethan's eyes immediately dropped to the broken collar lying in her lap. Relief crossed his expression so suddenly and honestly that it almost hurt to look at. "You are alive," he said quietly. Lyra stared at him in disbelief. "You actually came back." Ethan laughed once under his breath while crouching beside her. "Yeah, turns out I make terrible life decisions." Heavy metallic impacts echoed somewhere deeper in the district. Security teams sealing exits. Ethan looked toward the sound briefly before turning back to her. "Can you walk?" Lyra tried again. Her legs trembled violently beneath her. Before Ethan instinctively steadied her arm. The contact startled both of them for half a second. His hands were rough from years of repair work, warm despite the cold station air. Lyra swallowed carefully against the raw pain in her throat. "Not quickly." "Good enough." Another station announcement echoed through the plaza. "Unauthorized aid to sentenced individuals is punishable under corporate emergency code." Ethan looked upward toward the surveillance cameras still rotating above them. Then he simply shrugged. "Bit late for that now." Lyra studied him carefully while emergency lights painted shifting colors across the empty district. She had spent years around politicians, executives, military officers, people who always measured risk before compassion. But Ethan Walker looked exhausted and terrified, and completely determined anyway. It made no logical sense. "Why?" she asked softly while he helped her move away from the pillar. "Why would you throw your life away for someone you do not even know?" Ethan guided her carefully through the nearly abandoned plaza while distant security boots echoed closer through surrounding corridors. "You want the honest answer?" Lyra nodded weakly. Ethan glanced back once at the broken restraint collar still lying abandoned beneath the billboard. Rainwater continued dripping onto the cracked metal casing, while giant advertisements above the plaza kept playing cheerful vacation commercials like nothing had happened. "Because everybody else already decided your suffering was normal," he said quietly. "And I could not live with myself if I started believing that too." Lyra looked at him for several silent seconds while alarms screamed overhead and red warning lights flashed across the waking station. Then something inside her finally cracked. Not pride, not fear. The loneliness. Tears filled her violet eyes before she could stop them. Ethan immediately looked away politely like he had not noticed. Somehow that kindness broke her heart even more. She tightened her grip weakly around his sleeve as they disappeared together into the maintenance corridors beneath Khepri. 9 while the station searched desperately for the human who had chosen compassion over obedience. The cargo shuttle departed Khepri, 9 at exactly 6:17 a.m. station time. Ethan knew because the old transport's cockpit clock blinked uneven green numbers above the windshield while the docking clamps released with a deep metallic groan beneath the floor. Outside the scratched forward glass, the massive station slowly drifted farther away against the darkness of space, its endless rings of steel and artificial lights glowing cold blue like a machine too large to care about the people trapped inside it. Ethan sat slumped against the cargo bay wall behind the cockpit with his jacket half folded beneath Lyra's head. The adrenaline keeping him moving for the last several hours had finally burned out somewhere during the escape through the maintenance tunnels. Now every muscle in his body felt heavy. Exhaustion settled deep into his bones while old fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. The shuttle smelled like coolant leaks, recycled air, and dust that had probably been there for years. It was ugly, loud, barely functional, but it was warm. Lyra sat quietly across from him wrapped in the silver thermal blanket while the shuttle's autopilot guided them toward the outer shipping lanes. The bruising around her throat had darkened beneath the pale cabin lights, but color had finally started returning to her skin. She no longer looked like someone fading away, just tired. Human tired. Alien tired. The kind that came after surviving something you had already accepted would destroy you. Neither of them had spoken much since leaving the station. There was nothing left to explain anymore. Khepri, 9 had made its position clear. Ethan closed his eyes briefly as the shuttle engines vibrated through the cargo deck beneath him. You should get some sleep, Lyra said softly from across the bay. Ethan let out a weak laugh. Pretty sure station security disagrees with that plan. They will not catch us before we reach the outer colonies. You sound very confident. Lyra looked toward the cockpit window where distant stars drifted silently beyond the glass. My father taught me many things before he stopped being my father. Ethan studied her. Quietly for a second. There was sadness in her voice now, but no bitterness. That surprised him. Most people carried bitterness like armor after surviving cruelty. Lyra carried grief instead. Somehow that felt heavier. A warning light suddenly flickered above the shuttle controls before stabilizing again. Ethan groaned softly. Of course this thing has electrical problems too. Lyra tilted her head faintly. You complain about machines constantly. Machines deserve it. Ethan rubbed tired eyes with one hand. At least machines break honestly. Silence settled gently between them afterward while the shuttle drifted farther from Khepri 9. Through the cockpit glass, the station looked smaller now. Distant. Almost harmless from far away. But Ethan knew better. Places did not become cruel overnight. They became cruel slowly. One ignored injustice at a time. Lyra's voice interrupted his thoughts quietly. When I spoke against the suffering markets during the Senate hearing, she paused briefly. I thought people would be horrified. Ethan looked at her. Some probably were. Not enough. Her violet eyes reflected starlight from the cockpit window. Do you know what frightened the corporations most? Ethan shook his head. Not my speech. Not the politics. It was the possibility that people might begin seeing each other as individuals again instead of entertainment. Ethan stared at her for a long moment. Then he glanced back toward the shrinking station outside the window. Thousands of lives still trapped inside it. Workers. Children. Exhausted people pretending not to feel things anymore, because feeling too much made survival harder. Finally, he spoke quietly. I almost walked away too. Lyra looked at him carefully. Ethan shrugged weakly. First time I saw you in that plaza, I kept moving with everyone else. The confession hung in the quiet cargo bay between engine vibrations and humming lights. Lyra lowered her eyes briefly before answering. But you came back. Ethan stared out at the stars beyond the glass. Endless darkness scattered with distant worlds and cold light. Yeah, he murmured softly. I guess eventually I realized something. Lyra waited. Ethan looked toward her one last time. If suffering only matters when it happens to us personally, then eventually we stop being people at all. The shuttle drifted silently through open space while artificial dawn from Khepri 9 faded into the distance behind them. Lyra sat quietly beneath the dim cargo lights with Ethan's old jacket folded across her shoulders and tears still faintly visible in her violet eyes. Outside the windshield, the stars reflected softly against the glass. And for the first time in a very long while, they no longer looked cold to her.